Well, great. Welcome to AICGS, and
Thank you.
congratulations to you for this year's DAAD AICGS Award, and well-deserved. Politics and international relations, and much of the work you've done applies not only to the past but to the present. And of course, we're interested in the future as well around here. I, first of all, wanted to ask you, when you think about the work you've done on Germany over the last several years, and even as far back as you want to go, we are on this occasion looking at the 25th anniversary of German unity. It seems like it was just yesterday we were all in front of the wall, or at least some of us were marveling at the fact that most of our comrades and people said, that will never happen in my lifetime. That was the usual mantra. And now it's 25 years later. And I think that what we're interested in is gathering some thoughts about what has that created, not only in terms of what it did create in 1990, but what it's created now in 2015 for Germany, and of course from our perspective for German-American relations as well. But what I guess my first question would be is, what's your takeaway looking at the 25th anniversary of German unity? Not so much as dissecting what happened in 1990, but what are we looking at now?
I think we're looking at a Germany that's emerging with a sense of itself as a historical actor, maybe in a lot of ways for the first time since the end of World War II. I think that it's been slow in coming. I think there was a lot of inertia after 1990 which preserved many of the same basic outlooks and institutions of West Germany well into the end of the 1990s. I think since the shift to Berlin, the emergence of a Berlin Republic has given way to a greater willingness of Germans to think about themselves as having a direct impact in the world.
So the old mantra that came out of George Herbert Walker Bush, partners in leadership, they're beginning to kind of gravitate in that direction. I sometimes in my own thinking about this change that equation and they say leaders in partnership. Germany becoming more of a leader, certainly in Europe, right?
Yeah.
Let me ask you a similar related question, though. When you think about Germany moving into this role and how it's developed and evolved over this last quarter century, what do you think it's done to German-American relations, this unification process, and where we are now with this Germany you just described? What's the other side of that equation look like, the way we look at Germany?
Well, I guess I could see your interest in the effect of this. As a historian, I'm often thinking about, what is the cause of this? And I would say that the process of digging in to understand Germany's own place in the Cold War and in the present-day world has involved a certain desire to seek distance from the United States, and the discoveries have in turn tended to augment that desire for a bit more distance. In other words, I see this as a sort of, I guess you might almost call it a dialectic, where Germans become more aware of, say, the formative role of the United States in German institutions, and this, as those institutions are then critically imagined and investigated, turns into a bit more of a critique of Germany's own society and, more broadly, the transatlantic relationship which gave rise to some of these institutions.
So you're saying that basically the Germans are taking a look back and saying there are things that we needed at the time in 1990 that basically led to German unity. I mean, if it hadn't been for the United States and in the lead on that, it probably wouldn't have been as easy to deal with the Brits and the French and certainly not the Russians. But you're saying that 25 years later, Germany is looking at its relationship with the United States in a more, you use the word distance from the U.S. Maybe I can press you on that. What do you mean by distance?
Well, to be honest, I think the historical past, now, of course, remembering that I'm a historian, what I'm most aware of all the time is the extent to which Germans are conscious of having a past, and not only a past that stopped in 1945, but a past which continued into the 1950s and 1960s. So what I've seen is actually an exploration of the early history of institutions such as the BND, exactly, the intelligence service, and the Constitutional Protection Office, and the Foreign Ministry, And this, in turn, has led to new discoveries, essentially, about the extent to which the United States helped to steer the origins of those institutions. And this has reinforced a narrative in today's Germany which seeks distance. Now, you asked me what I mean by distance. By distance, I mean a call in some circles for complete sovereignty. Now, I think that this is exaggerated. I think that Germany has been a sovereign actor since 1990, and it was many ways sovereign since 1955. Nevertheless, there is a growing segment of opinion, I think, in Germany, which is determined to show a bit more independence from the transatlantic world which the United States and then West Germany helped to foster.
And would that then have more to do with the fact that even though Germany seeks that maybe new calibration, they're also seeing themselves involved, immersed in a Europe that also maybe also wants that distance?
Yes, I suspect that that's the case. I think that in a lot of ways, Europe seems to be playing a bit less of a role in the last few years as Germans think about conflict and crisis. And I think that that's actually a positive development. I think that Germans have hid behind Europe sometimes, and they've essentially been waiting for a European voice to emerge. And I think that what we've seen in the Greek debt crisis, in the most recent refugee crisis, and in several other instances, is a Germany that's not going to wait to see what other European leaders decide. So I think that that's a positive development. So I'm not sure that it's Europe that's leading Germany away from the United States. I think it's more internal processes. I do suspect that the long run, since you're concerned about the future here, I mean, the long run of Germans' greater sense of self-awareness is likely to be, at long last, a greater German willingness to take responsibility.
Right. And one at the time when it's struggling with that at the moment, though, here you have a United States that is also facing some questions about not only options but limitations. In other words, we need to have
Yes.
a partnership in leadership or a leadership in partnership or whatever it is. It isn't just a mantra, it isn't just a throwaway line, largely because of the fact that we're not the same country we were in 1990 either, are we? So if that's the case, if the United States is really not the same country as it was back then, it's gone through a lot of trauma and to some extent a lot of changes, and quite frankly has been groping with what it can and cannot do. Germany is going through changes and trying to figure out what it can grow into and what also the context of Europe is going to set in terms of parameters. Overall, when you say then if we can come into a kind of a way of describing this, what is the context of now? Are we in a transition period that isn't quite visible? Are we always, as you historians say, in a transition period? But is there some way you can help us understand where are we now, and what would you say the immediate things that we have to cope with, respectively, but also maybe in how they impact on each other? What does that picture look like to you as an historian at this point?
Well, I think that we're looking at a period when Germany needs to consolidate its thinking about itself in the world. And until that happens, I think there's going to be a lot of treading water across the Atlantic. I think that the formulas that were once on the table are not viable for the future. I remember back in around 2009, Chancellor Merkel was talking about sort of a U.S. and Europe system with two balanced poles. I just don't see the United States as having shown much interest in that model. And that, of course, I think leads us to wonder whether the transatlantic model, the language we're all used to using, is going to continue to inspire Germans. I'm very worried about that because I suspect that the only way Germans will find a reason to continue to affirmatively help with the construction of sort of the project that we all support, a world of stable trade and peace, that Germans will have to find their own reasons for this. And I'm not, of course, concerned about the Germans who are sitting in the old established parties. But I see a very strong anti-establishment movement in Germany. It's, of course, taken root in the internet, but it's shown itself in the streets. I think that these are voices that will not be placated with the standard vocabulary of transatlantic cooperation.
You know, Will, it sounds like you're talking about something we discuss here a lot, and that is the need for a new narrative.
Yes.
And that's your job. I mean, in a sense, as an historian, you're telling us how we should understand what has gone before, but also how, and you know the expression in German, Herkunft is Zukunft. And I think you're probably correct in the sense that the narrative of the 1945 period, or the notion of the Berlin airlift, and all of the things that went into the narrative about the glue of German-American relations, is in transition. That glue, the form of it, the content of it might be seriously changing. The one thing that I think would be interesting, maybe to close on, is the fact that what alternatives do we have is often the question. I mean, we have this level of interdependence for many, many decades. Some people would call it codependence. Some people would say it's an increasingly less asymmetric equation than it used to be. All of those things describe a transition over 25 years. But in the end, let me come back to the question. I mean, what alternative is there? Isn't there really the ability to continue to figure out why we need each other? Isn't that as important as it always has been?
Yeah, I do think so. Of course, every new historical situation has its own factors, but I've been spending a lot of time now looking at the 1970s. And what I see then is a West Germany which is also striving for a bit more independence from the United States, particularly in the time of Helmut Schmidt. There were a lot of tensions over issues such as nuclear sales to Brazil, and of course a lot of famous tensions over the look of the nuclear posture for the Western Alliance. I think that there were some Americans who were very alarmed, particularly in the public sphere, by voices in Germany, a vision of a Germany that would somehow undermine Western values by trading with the wrong people circulated, and it created the potential then, and I suspect that you remember those days, created the potential for a weakening of the transatlantic fabric. I think I would argue that although the Carter administration ended up with a lot of, as the Germans call it, broken porcelain, as a result of their pressure on the German government, I think the ability to have a transatlantic argument was actually healthy. In the long run, I think it helped to clear the air a little bit. When Germans, for example, began to explore the results of supporting a certain anti-American feeling in parts of the world like South America, Germans quickly discovered that this was not necessarily a good train to be on. And so I think what I would say for the present day is that there's no need to overreact when Germans begin to say they don't want to participate in certain actions. For example, when the German foreign minister in 2011 decides to abstain rather than take part in the UN vote about Libya, that led to a lot of criticism, of course, but that was a sovereign German decision. And I think that a bit of patience on the part of those who believe in the larger transatlantic project is probably necessary because, every generation has to learn for itself why it takes part in these cooperative institutions. And I think that we're in the middle of a learning moment. I suspect that in the next few years we'll see I hesitate to call it more mature, but that's what I think we're looking for here, a more mature readiness to express German interests as being a part of some kind of larger, not just European, of course, but transatlantic community.
A maturing relationship, if you will. I used to use the expression that when Germany was in the Cold War period, it was the object of American foreign policy. When it became sovereign and unified, it became the subject because we began to think about working with Germany on a number of other issues.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that gets back to the initial comments we made. The definition of interdependence has changed. The need for it may be the same. Thank you, Will, and congratulations once more on your
Thank you.